Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Having to rely on other teams to determine your playoff fate can be incredibly stressful. You have no control over the situation at the time, and knowing that one team can make or break your season, and knowing that there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, can be rough. Sometimes, as was the case with the New York Giants in 1984, when they needed both the St. Louis Cardinals and Dallas Cowboys to lose so they could make the playoffs, and both of those things happened, it works out. You can learn more about that situation by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Sometimes, as was the case with the New York Giants in 2020, when they needed the Philadelphia Eagles to lose, and the Eagles responded by inexplicably benching Jalen Hurts in the middle of the game for Nate Sudfeld, it doesn't work. But of all the instances of this happening in NFL history, there might not be anything funnier than this one. Imagine the president of a team being asked about their odds of another team winning a game and helping them out, and the president says that not only is that not going to happen, but that the team in question flat out stinks, and there's no chance whatsoever that they pull off the upset. And the team that needs the help isn't even going to watch the game, because there's no point, because there's no way that the team they need to win has a chance in the world at winning. Well, in 1963, that's exactly what happened, and this is the story behind that. Before I talk about the comments of the scenario that caused this to occur, we need some context to understand the teams involved, as well as the structure of the league that would allow for such a scenario to occur. The year is 1963, and in the Western Conference, there are two teams that are a class above everyone else. The team in second place is the Green Bay Packers, as they enter the final week sitting at 10-2-1. They're playing some of the best football in the entire NFL, as was to be expected, considering the fact that these were Vince Lombardi's Packers that we were talking about. They were the winners of the last two NFL championships, had represented the West in the last three NFL championships, and including the playoffs, had lost a grand total of 6 of their last 43 games, losing just 14% of the time in that stretch. The Packers had a point differential of plus 159, which was the best in the league. Their 189 points allowed was the second fewest in football, and their 348 points scored was the second most in football, only behind the New York Giants. And they were coming off of a dominant 31-14 victory over the Los Angeles Rams, where they outgained the Rams 378-170 in total yardage. However, despite all those numbers and despite all those statistics, the Packers were not leading the Western Conference heading into the final week of the season. Rather, the team that was leading it was their arch rival, the Chicago Bears. Chicago entered this one just a hair above the Packers, holding on to a 10-1-2 record. It's funny because when you look at their offense, it wasn't anything crazy. The Bears had scored just 277 points through their first 13 games, which was in the bottom half of the league. And yet the Bears had the best record in football, had the third best point differential in football, had lost just one game all year, and gave Green Bay both of their losses. As you probably guessed, the way that they did it was with a stellar defense. What the Bears were doing in 1963 on the defensive side of the ball was truly remarkable. They had allowed just 130 points all year, which was the fewest in football by a comfortable margin. For some perspective, only one other team had allowed less than 240 points, and here were the Bears at 130, allowing a mere 10 points per game. They held their opponent to 7 points or less in 8 of their 13 games, and only once did they allow a team to score more than 20 points. Entering the final week of the season, the Chicago Bears were in a fantastic spot atop the conference. And that's where things were about to get bizarre. Back in 1963, the playoff format was incredibly straightforward. You didn't have to work out seeding or tiebreaker scenarios or anything like that whatsoever. There were no wild cards, so only the winner in each conference made it to the NFL Championship. If two teams were tied atop the standings, then there was no head-to-head tiebreaker or point differential tiebreaker or conference tiebreaker or anything like that. Instead, there would be a playoff game between those two teams to determine who would represent the conference in the championship game. This happened a few times, including 1957, when the Detroit Lions and San Francisco 49ers were atop the West with identical 8-4 records, 1958 when the New York Giants and Cleveland Browns were atop the East with identical 9-3 records, and 1952, when the Detroit Lions and Los Angeles Rams were atop the West with identical 9-3 records, just to name a few. With the Bears sitting at 10-1-2 and the Packers sitting at 10-2-1, the scenario heading into the final week of the season was pretty simple. If the Bears won their game against the Lions, then they would be in the NFL Championship for the first time since 1956, and would have a chance to win their first title since 1946. No matter what the Packers did, as long as the Bears won their game, because the Bears control their own destiny, they would be the conference champions. If the Packers won and the Bears lost, then the Packers would be the conference champions for the fourth straight year, and the Bears would be on the outside looking in. And in a scenario where the Packers tied and Bears lost, there would be a playoff game to determine the conference champion, and what would have easily been the biggest game in the history of the storied rivalry at the time. However, what made things interesting is that while the Bears were playing the Lions on Sunday, the Packers were playing the 49ers in a nationally televised Saturday game, being shown across the country from coast to coast. This meant that the Bears had the possibility of knowing their fate before their Sunday game against Detroit. If the Packers won, the Bears would know that they needed to win. However, if the Packers lost, then the Bears could pop the champagne and celebrate the conference title without having to worry about the outcome of Sunday's game. And a lot of times, for something like this, you'll see teams gather for watch parties, as they'll watch the game together. But for the Bears, with their season potentially on the line, they decided not to do this. And the reason why? Because in their eyes, the 49ers flat out stunk. Imagine that you're the president of the Chicago Bears, or a key front office member of the team, and a reporter asks you about the Packers-49ers game and the possibility that the Packers could lose and clinch your team a playoff spot. What would most people say in this situation? In all likelihood, they'd say something along the lines of, at the end of the day, we can only control what we can control. Or we're not worried about that game because a win on our end gets us in, so we're just focused on taking care of our own business and not relying on anyone else. Or while a Packers loss would be nice, we're just focused on winning on Sunday, and whatever happens in that game happens. That's the typical response in that situation. However, that's not the response that team president George Halas Jr. in his first season as the team president took. Rather, he took an approach that we haven't really seen before, and roughly 60 years later, we haven't seen since. Because he was asked that same question, and was asked about whether or not the team would be watching the Packers game on Saturday, since it was nationally televised and had huge implications on the Bears. Halas' response was that they would not be holding a watch party, and that they would be home or wherever they be for that day. And it wasn't because the Bears were holding practice at the same time or holding meetings, or because the team didn't want the players out the day before a big game. It was because in Halas' mind, the 49ers had absolutely no shot at winning the game. As Halas Jr. bluntly said, there is no sense being optimistic or biting fingernails over that one. This week, I refuse to consider the 49ers have a chance. I don't think they even have a prayer of a chance. Can you imagine a team president saying that today? Can you imagine a team president saying straight up, yeah, this team has no shot whatsoever at winning? Halas Jr. was saying that the Bears were not even going to waste their time watching the game or preparing any conference champion celebration or watch party because the 49ers were just that bad. And what makes this all the more hysterical is that entering the final week of the season, the Bears had one loss all year. Guess what team gave them that loss? That's right, it was the San Francisco 49ers, who beat them 20-14 in Week 6. And what makes this even funnier was the fact that in the penultimate week of the season, the Bears played the 49ers again in a rematch and won 27-7, with the Niners turning the ball over 5 times, and with Niners starting quarterback Lamar McCann going 7 for 24 with 59 yards passing, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 4.9, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Halas Jr. saw the Niners up close and personal a few days ago, and basically said that this team had no chance whatsoever of beating Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers, so why even bother getting your hopes up? And as blunt and as harsh as those comments were, at the end of the day, Halas Jr. was right. Sort of. Maybe Halas Jr. was trying some reverse psychology and was trying to get San Francisco's players motivated by publicly calling them out and doubting them, giving them bulletin board material since he knew wholeheartedly that no one on the Packers would dare do that. God only knows what Lombardi would have done if a Packers player did such a thing. Maybe Halas Jr. was saying this out of praise, respect, and admiration for the job that Lombardi was doing in Green Bay, and it was meant as a compliment for the Packers and not as an insult for the 49ers. Whatever the case was, the Bears were so confident that Green Bay was going to defeat San Francisco that they were just flat out refusing to watch the game together, because it would have been pointless and would have been a waste of time. And when the teams met in San Francisco on December 14, 1963, in front of that national television audience on CBS, I think everyone was shocked, especially since the Packers handily beat the 49ers 20-10 just 3 weeks before, that this game was actually competitive. Even though Green Bay had everything to play for, and even though San Francisco at 2-11 had nothing to play for, this was looking like it had the makings of one of the biggest regular season upsets of all time. The two teams exchanged touchdowns multiple times throughout the first half, and 30 minutes into the game, amazingly enough, the Packers and 49ers were tied at 14 apiece. I remember that in 1963, there was no overtime, so tied games were real possibilities. If this result held, then Chicago, worst case scenario, would be guaranteed a spot in the playoffs. However, despite some valiant efforts on the part of San Francisco, the Packers prevailed. Boyd Dowler caught a 50-yard touchdown pass from Bart Starr in the third quarter to make it 21-14 in favor of the two-time defending champions. And even though the Niners closed the margin a bit in the fourth quarter on a 44-yard field goal by Tommy Davis, the Packers ended up winning it by a final score of 21-17. It was close. In fact, it was a lot closer than just about anyone expected, especially George Halas Jr. But a win is a win. And the win meant that Chicago, even though they still control their own destiny, needed to win against the Lions in order to take the conference title and advance to the NFL Championship and be one game away from winning it all. Sure enough, that's exactly what they did. When Halas Jr. said that it would be up to the Bears to determine their own fate, he was dead on. The Bears had to win this game, one of the most important games in the history of the franchise, to advance to the title. And it was looking dicey at times. The Lions led it 7-3 at the half after Bears quarterback Billy Wade threw an interception to Larry Vargo, who returned it 42 yards for a touchdown. But the Bears bounced back in the second half. They scored 3 touchdowns in the half, with Tommy Morris scoring from 51 yards out to give Chicago a 10-7 lead, Mike Ditka scoring from 22 yards out to extend the lead to 17-7, and Dave Woodsell having a 39-yard pick six in the fourth quarter to officially put the game out of reach, as the Bears won it 24-14 to advance to the NFL Championship as the champions of the Western Conference, officially eliminating Green Bay from playoff contention. And in the 1963 NFL Championship, the Bears did exactly what they had to do, and defeated the New York Giants by a final score of 14-10. With the Bears trailing in the second half, Billy Wade punched it in from 1 yard out to give Chicago their first lead of the game. And Chicago's defense, which was the best in football and had been stout all season, came to play on a cold, chilly day at Wrigley Field where the wind chill was -11, as the Bears did not allow the Giants to score a single point in the second half. For Chicago, this was their 8th title in franchise history, and their first since 1946, which coincidentally came against the New York Giants. As funny as this whole situation was, it all worked out perfectly for the Bears at the end of the day. Still, it's hard to imagine anything like this happening today. The phrase "any given Sunday" exists for a reason, even if the game in question is taking place on a Saturday. Imagine a prominent front office member flat out saying to the press that they needed another team to win in order to make it to the postseason. But there's no way that that's going to happen because that team stinks and would need an act of God to have it happen. It's quite the colorful comment, to say the least. And even though the Bears didn't even so much as entertain the thought that the upset could happen, if it somehow did, then the comments made by Halas Jr. would have gone down as maybe the coldest takes in NFL history. Not that I think the Bears are complaining, considering how everything played out in the end. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.